Hey everyone, welcome to today's video. Welcome to the Gamey Daddy channel. So I took a break to play a signature game that I've really been enjoying, and I must say that it is an understatement to say that Spider-Man Miles Morales is a good Spider-Man game. Now, regardless of your thoughts whether Miles Morales deserves to be Spider-Man, being such a new iteration of the superhero and already has his own animated movie and also a game, that's a whole different case. What I can say is the writers try their best to represent this character in the best possible light. But that's not necessarily my video. My video is basically a retrospective on how one of the best looking games that was set in New York City missed a great opportunity when it went to a sequel. And for those of you who are Tom Clancy's The Division players, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So we're going to jump into this and we're going to look at a few missed opportunities and what I feel that a future Division must have in order to be able to win its fans and also provide a very solid entry by taking notes from Spider-Man and Spider-Man Miles Morales. Both games were released in a 2-year window, one in 2018 and then the other one in 2020 with the PlayStation 5. Now, Tom Clancy's The Division 1 was a game set in New York City, post-apocalyptic, with the atmosphere and that cluster that New York City is able to bring to a game. For some strange reason, I never necessarily understood why this city was a big deal until I started to look back at The Division 1 after The Division 2 was released, and I noticed that the landscape, Washington, D.C., was actually a very well done and well designed landscape. That wasn't enough. You see, those of us who played the Division 1, all we knew was that atmosphere that New York set and the tone that the city brought to the gameplay experience. And so being immersed in that world, it's very difficult to disconnect yourself. And I think one thing that Massive did wrong was to take the Division 2 to another city because I felt like it was way too early for that transition to happen. Now, I will say it is a justified move nonetheless because it's a narrative move from New York to Washington, D.C. The only problem was it was a narrative move that was made way too early in the game's direction. Now let's look at Spider-Man Miles Morales and look at Marvel Spider-Man of 2018. When I first saw Spider-Man Miles Morales, all I thought to myself was they're using basically the same formula. At first I shrugged it aside. I said they're using the same city. They're going to be using Spider-Man. Most of the swinging is going to be quite similar. They're also going to implement some systems that are already known to the players and it's going to feel very familiar. I don't necessarily see myself playing this. So I took the cheap route and went and rented the game rather than buying it because I was still curious and there are Spider-Man fans in my house. But I have to say the familiarity is actually one of the best parts of the game to me because I don't have to run around and trying to learn or achieve a new learning curve in order for me to get through the game. If anything, all I'm doing is enjoying the new iterations, the new systems, and the new special moves of this new Spider-Man character, and that's where they've centered the enjoyment around because I can traverse the city the very same way. I can take on enemies the very same way. Enemies who were in the old Spider-Man game have similarities with the enemies in this new game, even though yes, there are differences, but it still gets to say, okay, this Spider-Man Miles Morales game has its own unique bosses and its own unique AI and the way that they work. Also, the abilities have, some things that will be a little similar, but Miles Morales is a Spider-Man that actually in reality is very different. If you look at the way the skill trees, if you look at the way the RPG systems of Spider-Man have been set up and differentiated between both games, I think Tom Clancy's The Division could have leveraged that to have very similar systems but unique aspects when they brought their sequel out. Even though I'm a big fan of the fact that they were able to move the narrative to Washington, D.C., I've come to look back and say, that's a narrative move that needed to happen, but that narrative move should not have happened at the time that it did because Insomniac has used this formula, understanding that this is exactly where things need to be and have basically been successful. Now, we can argue Spider-Man is a character that lives in New York City, just as Batman is a character that lives in Gotham. So there's almost no reason for these characters to find themselves in a different place. Well, let's argue that and flesh that out a little bit more. If you look at some of the Spider-Man cinematic aspects of things, we have seen Spider-Man actually move away from New York City, even though it's been temporary, but he's gone away from home a little bit. In fact, if you go look at Spider-Man Far From Home, or I think it's Spider-Man Homecoming, I can't remember the in the line of the Tom Holland Spider-Man, series, the cinematics, they even at one point went to Washington D.C. But one of the really important things that you have to do when you're setting up your Spider-Man universe games or your games that are set in specific locations is you really want to harness that location. You really want to establish it as a home base so that anything that moves away from there is just a one-off, and then everything circles back to the home base, the area where this hero or your character is actually well established. Many games will do this. They'll do a circular path and bring the hero back home. In the case of God of War and Kratos, you circle through the not all 9 realms, but multiple realms, and you bring your character back to Midgard, back to his cabin in the woods. Even when a God of War Ragnarok comes out, they also hinted that it's most likely going to be starting and continuing from that specific home location. And I think this is what a lot of the Division community missed. Many people considered their agent's home to be New York City. For them to now move so quickly into another city was most likely too much of a transition in terms of atmosphere, world, and setting. Many times, I think these are things that really do get overlooked. And I think Massive made a very strategic leap, but the strategic leap was done at the wrong time. Sometimes it's easy to want to move your art direction, but I think sometimes it's okay just to temper those moves and take it easy, because ambition is good, and I understand their ambition with the Division 2. I feel like a lot of systems that are in Division 2, like the living world, the shooting mechanics, some of the new skill variants, I think those things could have been added to the Division 1, or in some cases, some skills that were basically redundant in the Division 1 could have been substituted for them while they kept us in New York City, perhaps expanding the map. This was a big criticism for the longest time, and I thought it's a criticism that was valid, and eventually it died down, but not until seeing another development company actually use this and be successful am I here scratching my head going, wow, they really did miss it. And I hope that even now that they've learned this lesson, if they're working on the Division 3, that they bring the hero back home. Back home would be New York City. There's a lot to be said about that environment. I hope that they're crafting the Division 3 in the New York City outlook, where we circle back and we put basically a better ending to the story. So this is something that I wanted to share with you guys. I want to hear your thoughts in the comment section. Do you think that the move to Washington, D.C. was necessary? Do you think it was unnecessary, or do you think it was too soon? I think it was too soon, but from a narrative perspective, I can see how it was necessary to also make. But, it's really telling, though, that even after they made the move to Washington, D.C. in the Year 2 DLC, they came back to New York. What does that tell us? That tells us that there's something to be said about bringing the hero back home. Anyways, I'll talk to you all soon in another video. Peace out.